Minutes after cutting a ribbon that bears his name, billionaire Adrian Shaw steps into a hospital portico and sees a 9-year-old girl behind the wheel of a running car, hands at 10 and 2, guarding a humming plastic box that's keeping her little brother alive. Security moves to shut it down. The battery is dying. The rules say, wait. The machine says, now. In the split second between liability and breath, Adrian's buried grief detonates, and he chooses to cross the cones. What he finds on the other side will rewrite what his money is for. The automatic doors sighed open and released Adrian Shaw into a late afternoon that smelled like rain and raw concrete. He did not look like a man who had just signed his name beneath a gleaming brass plaque. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, in a charcoal suit hanging off his shoulders as if it were embarrassed for him. Behind him, the new pediatric wing glowed with warm light, his name printed 20 inches high on the wall. He had shaken hands and cut a ribbon and smiled for cameras. He had said all the phrases that were expected of him: community, responsibility, hope, each one delivered from a mouth dry as paper. Now the valet lane was a queue of idling vehicles and damp impatience, horn taps ricocheting under the hospital's half-covered portico. A woman in scrubs hurried past him, pushing a machine that blinked like a city at night. A dad at the curb tightened his jaw to hold in tears. A mother murmured into the soft hair of a sleeping toddler, "If there is a heartbeat to a city, it is loudest outside a hospital, where people stand on thresholds and measure themselves against what is fragile and what endures." Adrian adjusted his cuff, and the monogram glinted AS, like a quiet rebuke. He was supposed to slide into the back of the black sedan the driver had pulled up. He was supposed to leave the ribbon and the cameras and recede into a world where everything responded when he tapped it with his finger. But the black sedan wasn't there yet. Traffic had congealed at the curb, and the driver was 6 cars back, boxed by a catering van and a small silver car that had been parked too close to the red-painted curb and then nudged forward, and then nudged forward again. He registered the movement without caring until he realized the silver car wasn't being pushed at all. It was inching forward with the gentle, awkward determination of a child learning a hand-me-down instrument. He saw the top of a head barely visible above the steering wheel. He saw 2 small hands, one at 10 o'clock, one at 2, gripping a leather wheel that was pocked with age. Where an adult's body would fill the driver's side, there was the narrow triangle of a little girl. Her chin barely cleared the rim. Her shoulders were squared with practiced seriousness, and her hair was mussed and caught in a thrift store barrette shaped like a strawberry. As the car crept, she craned her neck to look at the line of cones that marked where the emergency entrance began, and then pulled up just enough to let the catering van squeeze out into traffic. Someone swore. A nurse snapped her fingers at a volunteer. A security guard began striding across the lane with the righteous gravity of a planet. Adrian felt his pulse flare, as if someone had tugged a wire attached to his sternum. It carried with it a taste, sharp and metallic, of a winter years ago, and a bedroom where a girl's breath pipped like a bird before it caught and ceased. He was already moving before he decided to move. He stepped off the curb and dodged a wheelchair and a teenager on crutches and came up alongside the silver car just as the security guard rapped his knuckles on the glass. The little girl's head jerked, and the car jerked with it, lurching forward a foot, then another. The guard's hand flattened against the window. "You can't do that," he said, and his voice was the voice of every adult who has ever had to say it between a job and a judgment. "Where's your parent?" The girl's mouth made the shape of the words, but he couldn't hear them through the glass, and anyway, there wasn't time. A soft cough came from the back seat, the kind that starts as air and turns into something wetter, deeper, freighted with more than irritation. It grabbed Adrian by the back of the neck. "Wait," he said, and dug his fingers under the door handle. The car was locked. The guard made a face that said, "Both, are you serious? And this isn't your problem." The little girl unlocked the door, and when the door swung open, the smell of the inside of the car flooded out. Fast food salt, old upholstery, and something medicinal, sterile plastic and lavender hand sanitizer. "I'm not driving," the little girl said, which was true and not true at the same time. She was probably 9. The sweatshirt she wore was too big and the sleeves swallowed her wrists. Her eyes were too big, too, and the brown irises were so dark they seemed to catch and hold the light. "Whose car is this?" the guard demanded. "My dad's," she said, her chin lifted. "He's inside." "You can't sit here," the guard said. "You can't. What are you doing behind the wheel?" The cough came again from the back seat. Adrian leaned in, and the little girl looked at him without fear, which was somehow worse than if she'd flinched. He looked over the rim of the driver's seat and saw a little boy in the back, maybe 4, curled sideways across the seat, his lips pink, but his breaths too fast, each inhale shallow and a beat too soon, as if he were being chased in a dream and could not find a door. The boy had a mask strapped over his nose and mouth, the soft kind sold in drugstores. The mask's tubing snaked down into a plastic case, no bigger than a shoebox, that was wedged on the floor. The case hummed and rattled in a way that made a shape in your throat. A car inverter plugged into the lighter port. A nebulizer. The boy's hands, small, fierce, restless, picked at the frayed edge of the seat. On the floor under him were crumpled napkins and a half-empty box of sterile saline vials. The girl reached back with one hand and adjusted the mask. Her other hand stayed on the wheel. The car was in park. "We can't go in yet," she said, and her voice had a carefulness in it, as if it had been tutored by adults not to break. "He told me to stay here with Leo and keep it on, or he'll get tired again. The battery died. It only works when the car is on. It only works—" The guard's mouth hung open at the word battery. He looked at the humming plastic box as if it were a bomb. "The engine is running." "The alternator charges the thing," the girl recited. She stumbled on alternator and then mastered it. "I have to start it. He said to keep my foot ready on the brake in case the car moves." "Where is your father?" Adrian asked. He felt absurd asking it because the place was nothing but fathers and mothers and the edges they teetered on. "Inside," she said. "He went to find someone. We don't have a dock pass. They have a charger thing inside, but they said they're full." She said full the way a child learns to say mortgage and discharge, the sound of it heavy but the meaning held at arm's length. "He said to wait. He said if I got scared to honk, but if I honk, the guard gets mad and—" She glanced at the guard, then at Adrian, then back at the little boy who was staring at nothing with the furious focus of the very tired. "What's your name?" Adrian asked. "Mina," she said, and then as if she felt she should give something else. "Short for Wilhelmina, but nobody calls me that except my grandmother, and only when she's mad." "Okay, Mina," Adrian said. "I'm Adrian." He didn't add his last name. There was no point. In this space, his last name was a monolith, and he had spent an hour having it stuck to his chest with a ribbon. The guard gathered himself. "We can't have a child in the driver's seat," he said. "This is a liability. If something happens—" "If something happens," Adrian said. "It already is." He pointed at the humming case. "How long has that battery been low?" "Since before we got here," Mina said. "It was working at home, but then the light went red, and he said—" She swallowed, and her composure wobbled, and then reasserted itself. "He said we'd be okay. He said we'd be okay if I sat here and kept it on." The guard rubbed a hand over his face. He was a good man, you could tell. He had that weary good man look a lot of hospital staff wore, even the ones who weren't staff, but were hired to watch doors and ask people to smoke somewhere else. He stared at Adrian, as if deciding whether to let the rich man step into the story like they do in movies, or whether to insist that the rules keep everyone from tipping into chaos. Adrian met his gaze and felt something loosen in his chest. 2 minutes, the guard said at last, and lifted his chin at Adrian. "If you stand here." "I'll do more than stand here," Adrian said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. The hum changed pitch. The little boy coughed and his eyes pinched, the way a sleeping person's eyes pinch when a nightmare drives a nail in. The nebulizer's plastic mouthpiece had left condensation on the inside of the mask. Adrian took in the cracked leather, the map folded in the door pocket, the duct tape around the seatbelt anchor. He thought of the slick black interior of his car waiting 6 vehicles back. "What's wrong with him?" Adrian asked. He did not want to know. That was the thing about hospitals. You want to know until knowing is an obligation. "Bad lungs," Mina said, and then in the voice of a nurse taking history, "He's small for his age. He gets tired and sometimes he forgets." She didn't say forgets to breathe because maybe no one had said it to her like that. Adrian felt the old ache like an echo in a canyon. In his mind it took the shape of a white inhaler on a nightstand, and a little covered in stickers, and a time he had been in Zurich for a board meeting, and his phone had rung and rung and rung. When he had finally answered it, on a cold, dumb street while his driver circled, a voice had told him there had been a storm, and the power had flickered, and the battery in the machine had been not full enough. She had been fine, and then not fine, and then gone, the way a coin slips between a cushion and disappears. They told him it was no one's fault. In a sense, everything he had done since had been an argument with that sentence. A man came through the sliding doors, moving like a person who wanted to run but had forgotten how. He had a day's scruff smudged across his jaw and a stain of old coffee on his hoodie. He had tried to put himself together today and had run out of time. He was carrying a plastic case identical to the one humming in the car and some paperwork folded around it like a crude bandage. He saw the security guard and put his hands up before anyone accused him. "They said I need a respiratory tech to sign off," he said through short, embarrassed breaths. "They said they're coming, but they're not, and He swallowed. "I told her to stay with him. I told her I'd be 2 minutes, and I was 2 minutes, and then I was 10 because—" He looked down at his hands. "Because the paper was wrong, and they said to fill it out again, and what was wrong was the box where you write the mother's name, and I didn't know which thing to put because she—" He cupped his hand over his mouth, like the memory of the name wouldn't pass through it if he didn't let it. "Sir," the guard said, relieved to see a parent, and also not at all relieved because parents made everything more complicated. "You can't have your daughter in the driver's seat, if anything had happened." "But it didn't," Mina said, which was not yet an argument, and yet somehow was. Adrian reached for the door and clicked the engine off. The hum of the car died, leaving only the hum of the machine. The little boy's chest fluttered like the wing beats of something trapped. "We've got to get him inside," Adrian said. "Now." "I told them," the father said. "They said there are forms, and they're full, and—" He lifted the plastic case before his conviction ran out. "We have the machine from the clinic, but it's not— ours isn't. Insurance said—" He shook his head like a man trying to get water out of his ears. "I'm sorry," he said to the guard as if the apology would earn him passage. Adrian turned to the guard. "If someone stops you from saving a child because of a rule," he said, and his voice slipped into the register that made rooms go quiet, "it's a bad rule." "I don't make the rules," the guard said. He could feel his supervisor's shadow at his back. "Then come with us, and we'll take the blame together," Adrian said, and smiled in a way that made it clear he did not plan on sharing any blame. He scooped the plastic case from the floor and cradled it against his ribs. The machine's heat soaked into his shirt like a new heartbeat. The father leaned into the back seat and lifted his son and the nebulizer and the too long tube and the blue elastic headband the mask was attached to, all in one careful movement. The boy's head fell against his shoulder, and the father's hoodie darkened where the condensation kissed it. Mina hopped out of the driver's seat, closed the door with both hands, and then took her brother's little sneakers and wedged them under her arm. She looked at Adrian as if maybe he had been assigned to them by a story she hadn't expected to be in, and then at the guard who, after one small mutiny of conscience, nodded and started walking toward the sliding doors in front of them. "Make a hole," he barked, and his voice grew 3 sizes. "Respiratory coming through." The sliding doors opened on a wash of air conditioning and antiseptic, and a sound that was not exactly noise, but the shimmering, combined pitch of all that beeps and breathes and begs. The desk on the left looked like all hospital desks, covered in pens and laminated flowcharts and the tired elbows of people holding 100 strands together. The triage nurse looked up and then down. The guard angled his body to take the father's back, so that if anyone tried to stop them, they would hit a wall. Adrian moved as if the floor were a chessboard he had spent his childhood memorizing. A nurse with a pixie cut intercepted them. She took one look at the boy's chest and frowned. "Wait," she said. "Put him here." She rolled a portable monitor toward them and turned it on with a swipe that said she did this 20 times a day. "Do you have a diagnosis?" "Bronchopulmonary dysplasia," the father said, and the words came in a rush like freight. "He was early, 29 weeks. He was home, but the thing broke, and we had to bring him, and they said—" He held up the new machine like an offering. The nurse knelt so she was eye level with Leo. Her voice softened. "Hey, buddy," she said. "I'm Hannah. We're going to help you fill those lungs up like balloons. Deal?" She glanced up at Adrian because he was holding the older machine like a person holds a baby that is not theirs. He set it gently on the counter. Mina stood on her toes and peered at the monitor as if it were a scoreboard in a game she hadn't been told the rules of. Adrian stood shoulder to shoulder with the father, who smelled like stress and sugar and cheap coffee. "I'm Ramon," the man said automatically, as if introducing himself under the circumstances was good manners. "Her name's Mina. His is Leon, but we call him Leo." He pronounced it Leo, like the star sign. "He's tough." He looked at the shoelaces hanging from Mina's elbow and then at his son's cheeks, which had 2 faint dimples that deepened and disappeared with the struggle to breathe. "He's tough," he said again to someone, to his past self, to any God-accepting correspondence. They were ushered into a small room where a respiratory therapist had already turned down a bed and set out nebulizers like silverware. The machine Adrian had carried was plugged in. The new machine was unpacked. A hand checked a pulse oximeter on a tiny toe, and numbers spilled across a screen with the unforgiving brightness of a scoreboard. The therapist adjusted the mask. The nurse timed the breaths and murmured a count. The room did the thing that hospital rooms sometimes do, where it fills with people who know which cabinet contains the thing you need before you know you need it. For a moment it was a ballet of competence and compassion. For a moment the world's edges softened. Adrian took a step back to allow the work. He felt the 20 eyes of the last hour on his chest, photographers, donors, administrators, and shrugged them off like a jacket. He had built a company based on the proposition that you could design chaos out of lives with enough pressure and money. He had named an entire division Assurance. He had never been able to assure anything that mattered. The sliding door clicked open, and a woman in a cardigan and the authority of someone who understands forms stepped inside. Her name badge said Marla in block letters, and in smaller letters, Patient Services. She wore a smile like a tissue paper flower pinned to armor. "Which of you is Mr. Valdez?" she asked. Ramon lifted a hand as if she might not see him. "I understand we have a problem with your equipment authorization," she said. And she was good at this, which is to say, she acted as if problems were a series of steps and not an avalanche. "We're making calls." "Thank you," Adrian said before he could stop himself. She blinked at him, assessed the suit, the watch, the outline of the name on the new wing behind his head. "Ah," she said, the way people do when a piece on their board snaps into place. "Mr. Shaw," she added with the careful neutral used for donors, criminals, and other people whose presence requires navigation. "It's just Adrian right now," he said. The phrase surprised him with its softness. Her eyes tipped toward the hall, a gentlemanly suggestion. He stepped out with her into the corridor, and she lowered her voice. "The clinic loaned them a portable nebulizer, but it's faulty," she said. "We've offered to swap, but their insurance requires the script to be signed by a specific network provider. The provider is not on today." The workaround is simple, but the person who can sign off is at another facility, and in an hour they might not be reachable. Meanwhile, the child needs to breathe, Adrian finished, because he wanted to stand somewhere inside that sentence and not collapse. She watched him watch the room where Mina stood on the chair to hold the edge of her brother's new mask like she was participating in a ritual. "I don't suppose you carry a specialty credential in your pocket?" Marla asked with gallows amusement. She had learned to ask for impossible things from the rich with the same tone she asked for a pen from a neighbor. "I carry something else," he said, and pulled out his phone. His fingers typed the way a pianist plays a piece they have learned to perform on demand. He texted a name, then another. He dialed a lawyer who was also a friend who was also someone who owed him, and then a hospital board member who was also someone who liked his name on glossy paper. He said quietly, "I need a signature from a network provider in the next 30 minutes. I don't care if they're at their kid's soccer game. I don't care if they're on a boat. I will put a helicopter on the roof if you give me a name. This is not about a donation. This is about our reputation for being human." You know my line. He made it sound like a mission because missions call soldiers to attention. He made it sound like a favor because favors are currency that never devalues. He put the phone down and saw, through the window, Mina make faces at her brother through the clear plastic of the mask. Leo's eyes were sleepy but less frantic. The machine's hum had settled into a friendly purr. The number on the pulse oximeter ticked up a notch, then another, the way a morning radio volume rises when you turn the dial with a careful hand. Back in the room, Ramon's shoulders had unclenched by a degree. He looked like he had been clinging to a rope, and someone had tied a knot in it just below his fists. "Thank you," he said to the therapist, to the nurse, to the universe, like a person handing out compliments to the air in hopes it would take shape. "You did good, kiddo," the therapist told Mina. "You knew what mattered." "He told me," Mina said, meaning her father. Her eyes flicked to Adrian. "He came to the school once," she added, to nobody and everybody. "They gave him an award. He fixed the roof in the gym." She said it with the reverence of someone listing the miracles of a small-town priest. "Now it doesn't rain inside." "It was a good roof," Adrian said, and Mina nodded like yes it had been, as if roofs could be friends. Marla stepped back into the room with her hands pressed together, like she was carrying something in them. "We got the signature," she announced. "Don't ask me how. The system is still the system, but for the moment we have a seam in it. This little man is going to get a new unit, authorized and delivered to his home tonight." She smiled at Mina. "And 2 battery backups." Mina's face opened like a window, thrown up in a stuffy room. She looked at her father, and for a moment the structure of her braveness wobbled, and you could see the child under it, the one who, given the choice, would prefer to play tag in a parking lot rather than learn more about alternators than anyone ever should. Adrian stood very still. A ribbon cutting makes good pictures because there is a ribbon and there is a cutting of a ribbon, and people understand that as cause and effect. The world is not made of ribbons. It is made of this, of seams that are coaxed and worried and made wider by persistence and shamelessness and luck and the cheerful bullying of people who refuse to let a child stop breathing because a box isn't checked. He stayed until the machine was swapped and the technician, a woman with kind eyes and a twin tattooed swallows on her wrist, showed Ramon how to clean and check the filters, taught Mina to listen for the sound a dying battery makes, arranged without fuss for a line to be routed so that a power outage would turn the machine on, not off. He stayed until the fear evaporated from the small room like fog from a morning field. He stayed until Leo, heavy and drowsy and breathing deep, opened his eyes and said, "Mina," without lifting the mask, and then said it again with a little smile, like the name was his favorite candy. The release papers took another hour, not because anyone was cruel, but because the cogs were numerous. During that hour, Adrian learned that Ramon had worked construction until an injury, and then picked up shifts at a grocery store and delivered packages for an app, because the money was better, but not as good as you think, unless you never tried it. He learned that Mina had taught herself to braid by watching videos on a cracked phone screen because her aunt had hair down to her waist, and had showed her once and then forgotten. He learned that the mother, the box on the form for mother, had been gone for 3 years since a summer afternoon with too much heat, too many pills, and too few second chances. He learned that Ramon apologized for things that were not his fault, the way some people hum when they are nervous. When it was time to go, Adrian walked them down to the car because he didn't want to let go of this thing he could carry. Outside, the rain that had merely threatened had made good on its promise and slicked the pavement so that it shone like a black piano. He stepped to the passenger side and reached into his jacket. He took out a card. It was matte and in small font, and looked like the sort of card someone could mistake for the back of a different card. "Don't," Ramon said, rueful around the edges. "Don't do that thing where rich people give me money in a way that makes it feel like a business transaction." Then he laughed, ashamed of his own brazenness. "I'm sorry. That sounds worse out loud." "It didn't," Adrian said. He nodded at the door panel. "Can I show Mina something?" Ramon hesitated, then nodded. Mina looked like a child being summoned to look at a man's watch, but she did not come forward. She put her hand on her brother's knee and stayed still until he nodded. Adrian opened the passenger door and leaned in to show her the panel. "See that?" he asked, pointing at the rubber cover over the cigarette lighter port. "That's a 12V outlet," he said. She rolled her eyes and smiled. "I'm 9, she said, because she had learned everything about power that 9-year-olds are not supposed to learn. It made the box work. "What if there was a way to make the box work even if the car wasn't on?" he asked, and felt the line between inspiration and guilt. "That would be a miracle," she said. "She didn't revise it down to a product offering." He closed the door and stepped back into the rain. "The wing they named after me today," he said to Ramon, "that embarrassed kind of shift you do when you know you are asking people to hold a complicated thing. I'm proud of it. But I want to do something else that is less shiny. I want to build a station outside this hospital, outside every hospital, where people who need machines can plug them in. A quiet place with chairs that don't have metal edges and outlets that don't spark, and coffee, and chargers, and staff whose job description includes the words, 'Don't be cruel.' I want the power to stay on when the power goes out. I want to put battery backups in every home with these machines that don't cost a month's rent." Ramon stared at him as if he were describing a mountain he had just decided to move. "You can do that?" he asked. "I can't do it alone," Adrian said, "but I can start. And I will. And, if you'll let me, I'd like to start at your house." Ramon laughed, and the laugh ripped out of him, edged in months of frayed sleep and the relief that tends to make us a little unkind to ourselves. "You don't owe us that," he said. "I owe someone," Adrian said, and for the first time since the Zurich Street and the white inhaler and the call, he allowed himself to say her name in public, in the open air where anyone could hear it. "My daughter," he said, and felt the syllable stagger, and then stand. Her name was Sophie. She would be 12 today. She liked comics and mangoes and the smell of the inside of a new book. She died because of a few minutes without power. They told me there was nothing anyone could do. That was a sentence that made me into a person who purchases things to try to cross out words. But this—" He gestured at the car where Leo was singing the nonsense song of children whose lungs have come back online. "This is something." Ramon put out his hand and then changed his mind and put both hands on Adrian's shoulders and hugged him. It was not the careful hug you give a stranger at an awards banquet. It was the kind of hug men do when they are lifting a heavy piece of furniture. Adrian stood stiff for a second and then remembered how to be held. Before they left, Mina tugged on Adrian's sleeve. She had taken the card after all, holding it like a receipt for something you aren't sure you can return. "Can I ask you a question?" she asked, and he nodded, braced. "Children have a way of detonating the places you hide." "Why did you come over?" she said. "You could have gone to your car." He thought about the answer that would look good in a magazine, a shape of sentence about a community and vigilance and the nobility of noticing. He thought about the actual answer, which was not noble at all. "Because I was scared," he said. "When I saw you behind the wheel, I thought the worst thing." He swallowed. "And because I know the sound of that machine in my bones." She nodded like that aligned with a math problem she had worked out herself. "Sometimes grown-ups don't come because they're scared they'll be wrong," she said. "But sometimes you have to come anyway." "Sometimes," he agreed. The driver finally arrived, panting apologies. He had been trapped behind a delivery truck whose ramp had broken and blocked the lane, and then boxed in by a taxi, and then boxed in by that mysterious fluid that congeals around all the places where time matters. Adrian waved him off and said he'd walk. The rain had softened to a mist that felt like cool breath on his face. He stood on the curb and watched the silver car pull away into traffic. Mina sat in the back now, her head beside her brother's, her arm across his stomach. Ramon drove, both hands on the wheel, careful and calm, and new. The tail light blinked, a red dot pulsing, and then their car merged and was gone into the slow blue stream. He turned to the security guard who had returned to his post with the air of a man who had just crossed a small river without getting his cigarette wet. "Thank you," Adrian said. The guard shrugged. "I didn't do nothing." "You did," Adrian said. "You didn't make it harder." The guard gave him a look he recognized from men who have more power than they are allowed to use. "Those cones," he said, "they're useful, but sometimes they keep the wrong people out, you know?" "I know," Adrian said. He stood there long enough to feel the knowledge settle into him like a new weight that he wanted very much to carry. Over the next week, his assistants would challenge him gently, and then with more heat, on the idea of a series of hospital power stations, the permits and the expense and the optics, which in the language of big money are as real as physics. He would feel their questions tugging at his conviction like wind on a coat. He would go back to the hospital 3 times and sit in the windowed waiting room and watch people plug phones and machines into outlets that hung like uncertain fruit, and he would make diagrams on the backs of envelopes. He would call a friend who knew about battery chemistry and another friend whose business was building quietly elegant boxes for ugly problems. He would write the words "Sophie Stations" at the top of a page and cross it out, and write breath rooms and cross it out, and then write the door, because he wanted the name to sound like something you could open when there was no air in the room. He would go to a neighborhood south of the hospital with a van filled with things that hummed, and fans, and 2 women who wore uniforms without logos because they did not want to look like a favor you were obligated to accept. He would knock on a door that had a hand-lettered sign reminding visitors not to wake the baby. He would meet a grandmother who had taken her daughter's place at the table and who had 3 casseroles going on 1 stove burner and who refused to let him lift anything heavier than a clipboard. He would see the new machine plugged into a wall with a surge protector that had a cover so a little hand could not pull the plug. He would watch Mina show Leo how to press the button like she was a teacher taking a new student's hand. He would not stay long. He would stay long enough. He would go to a city building with a clerk whose title was Deputy Something, of something who had a drawer filled with stamped forms and a heart that was softer than the drawer. He would learn that if you sign a donation receipt, you can sometimes sign something else, and that if you stand quietly in a corner, someone might bring you the right form. He would recruit the security guard at the hospital, not because he needed muscle, but because he needed a person who could look at a line and know when to open it, like a zipper. He would learn from the respiratory tech that sometimes machines fail when they are perfectly fine because the people who run them are tired, and that sometimes tired looks like anger, and that often when you feed a tired person, it turns into gratitude. He would add coffee to the list of things that keep lungs open. But that was later. Now he began by walking. The rain had stopped, and the damp had arranged itself into a kind of shine. He passed the shiny plaque with his name on it, and thought not about the photo the press had taken of his hand on a pair of ceremonial scissors, but about 2 small hands on a steering wheel, holding the world steady for a brother. He remembered the reason she had been in that seat at all, and the reason stunned him in a way that did not pass like lightning, but lingered like a bruise, because a child had been asked to be a generator when the world around her could have been one and wasn't, because a system with 10,000 sockets had failed to find one into which to plug what mattered. He reached the sidewalk and turned right, away from the black car finally waiting at the curb with the back door open. He did not feel like a millionaire. He felt like a man whose excess had, for an afternoon, been exchanged for a function. It was a feeling like taking off a suit you had been wearing for a decade and discovering jeans folded in the back of a drawer that still fit. He put his hands in his pockets and felt as light and heavy as a person who has just been given a job that will take years and will save lives and will never be finished. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the board member with the signature they had squeezed through the seam. It was, "Because the world is funny like that," a smiling emoji. He typed back a thank you, and then another uncharacteristically with a period. Then he typed a third message that said, "Let's talk about building something," and hit send before he could decide it needed more commas or fewer. He crossed at the light and walked toward a world that would, someday, have small rooms with comfortable chairs and quiet outlets and volunteers who knew how to say, "It's okay, sit here, as long as you need." He imagined Mina's strawberry beret bobbing above a book in one of those chairs. He imagined Leo asleep with a hand flung over his head, and not because he couldn't breathe, but because he had played so hard he had earned rest. He imagined walking into one of those rooms on a day, far from this day, and seeing people who did not know his name plugging into what they needed, without asking, without explaining, without fear that a form would unmake them. He imagined a woman somewhere in a cardigan not having to invent a seam because there would be a door. He did not notice for the first 2 blocks that the sky had lightened in the east, as if a lamp had come on in a far apartment. He did not notice that the cars sounded less like animals and more like water. He did not notice that his shoulders had moved a 1/4 inch away from his ears. He walked and held in his mind the picture of a little girl behind the wheel of a car, not because she wanted to drive, but because she had been asked to become the power in a power outage. He held it the way you hold a photograph in a wallet, and, when you go to pay, your fingers find the edge, and, just for a second, you touch what is inside and remember. He decided he would remember, and he decided that remembering would be a verb. Later in the night, he would wake too early and sit at the end of his bed and stare at the wall of windows that turned the city into a constellation. He would be halfway between sleep and a list of tasks when he would hear, somewhere in the machinery of his mind, the hum of a small plastic box becoming a purr, and the slow, blessed sound of a child's breath easing into the rhythm it was born to keep. He would memorize that sound, and, like a metronome's tick, he would let it set his pace. He would not call it redemption, because redemption implies that anything equals anything else. He would call it work. And in the morning, when the sun pushed through the edge of the building and turned the stainless steel of his kitchen into a surface he could see himself in, he would text the number on the card he had given to Ramon. The message would say, "How is he?" And the answer would return 3 minutes later with a picture. A boy with 2 dimples showing because his mouth was wide in a laugh that opened every door in the 2 inches of screen it filled. Mina would have taken it. The angle would tilt a little. In the corner, on a table that looked like it had been rescued from a sidewalk, a small sturdy box would hum, and a cord would trail into an outlet, and a green light would indicate something simple and enormous. Enough? The next morning, before the world had quite declared itself, Adrian drove back to the hospital alone. The sky was washed thin, the color of paper left in a window too long. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the last bit, hands in his coat pockets, sober in a way that made coffee seem like a child's toy. The portico was calmer now that night shift handovers had finished and day shift routines had not yet swelled. He stood outside the sliding glass doors and watched the revolving choreography of quiet heroics. An orderly with a warm blanket, a woman with a bag of oranges for a sibling, a teenager wearing a jacket that said, "Champions," as if that word could be a talisman against whatever had brought him there. He was trying to decide whether to go in and find Marla, to look a second time at the machines that hummed and breathed, when a voice behind him said, "You came back." Marla had a to-go cup in her hand and a stack of forms in a clipboard that looked like it had gone to war and survived. She smiled quick and real, like two people meeting at a bus stop who happened to like the same book. "We talked about you all night," she said, "in a good way. The therapist, Mel, says your friend at the board pulled a rabbit from a hat. The father cried in a way that made the intern cry. Cry is the wrong word. He did a sound that was relief, and then sleep slammed into him." "Is Leo okay?" Adrian asked. "Okay is elastic," she said. "But yes, his oxygen held. They went home just before dawn. We insisted they take the loaner with the batteries, and we'll sort the paperwork before anyone has time to say the word non-compliant." She took a sip of her coffee and made a face. "You said something yesterday about building a place, about being a generator when the power is mean." "The door," he said, before remembering he had told no one that name yet. "That's what I wrote down. Because it should feel like when you're outside in the cold, and then you open a door and inside there's light and somewhere to sit. It shouldn't feel like a checkpoint." She nodded. "I don't do metaphor before 8, she said, "but that one will do." She looked at him with a levelness that felt like a hand placed lightly on his shoulder. "You know it will be ugly." "I do," he said. "I also know that ugly is not a synonym for impossible." She tilted her head toward the doors. "Come meet the ugliest parts," she said, and he followed her in, passing the place where yesterday he had stood with a machine in his arms like a bundle of sticks. They walked past the intake desk and the triage heroes and into a corridor that had the feel of backstage at a theater, the public polish dropped and replaced with the racks and bins and grit that make the show possible. She led him to a small office that had once been a supply closet and now held a desk flanked by towers of manila folders that could tell the history of 1,000 lungs. A corkboard on the wall was crowded with photos of pets and babies, and a postcard of a seaside town where the water was too blue to be local. She sat. He did not. He looked at the lists taped to the wall, battery models, vendors, voltage warnings, checklists written by someone who had made themselves the hinge between machines and breath. "You want to set up power stations," she said, cutting to the tendon. "Where?" "Here," he said. "Outside this hospital, then 2 more across town where the bus routes tangle, then as many as we can where people need them. Not just outlets, batteries that charge fast and hold their nerve, quiet ventilated rooms, clear signage in 3 languages, staff with training to handle a crisis, and the permission to be kind." "I can give you a list of everything that would try to get in your way," she said. "Zoning, fire codes, procurement. The landlord who owns the strip of sidewalk we actually thought the city owned. The parade of almosts that end with someone saying, 'We love this, but,' and then breaking your kind idea on the wheel of a legal phrase." "Good," he said. "I prefer my problems enumerated." "And not just bureaucratic," she continued. "Human. People will come to charge phones and vape pens in their own anger. People will come who have nowhere else to sit. Some will yell. Some will sleep. You will need to decide if this is a hospital program or a community promise. If it's a program, you'll need staff and ID checks and rules. If it's a promise, you'll need stomach and patience, and you'll spend the first months explaining to people that basic survival is not a loophole." Adrian felt the truth of it like a draft under a door. "Can it be both?" he asked. "Can it be formal enough to be funded and informal enough to be human?" "It can be designed to pretend it is both," she said, "which is the same thing sometimes if you don't look too hard at it." She shuffled the papers on her desk like a tarot reader composing a fate. "If your name is on the school gym roof and the pediatric wing, we can use that name as a crowbar. We can pry open some doors, If your name is on the front of this thing, the wrong kind of people will come too, wanting to turn it into a photo. Let them come, he said, and surprised himself with the steel in it. But let them come second. First, I need a pilot, something I can walk people into and say, this is what it is. Step over the threshold and tell me if you can breathe easier in here. When? She asked. As soon as permits allow, he said, and then, hearing himself, added, as soon as a tent can be rented and a generator can be quiet enough to not set off every baby monitor in a quarter mile. She grinned. There it is, she said, the compromise between what we want and what we can do Thursday. She wrote on a sticky note with a pen that had been chewed at the end. There's a side lot by the old ambulance bay we don't use anymore except to stack pallets. It's not pretty, but it's behind the windbreak and close to the oxygen storage. The facilities manager hates it because people stash things there and forget them. Facilities managers are the priests of hospitals. Get them on your side, and I'll get you my people. What's his name? Gus, she said. He looks like a man who could repair a battleship with duct tape and vodka. He drinks neither. He has opinions about signage and power lines that will save your life. Introduce me, he said. She stood. I can do better than that. Gus was built like a refrigerator tipped upright and fitted with a beard. He listened while they stood in the cold next to the side lot where a wind had piled leaves against the chain-link fence. He crossed his arms and looked at the asphalt with the same baleful fondness a farmer reserves for weather. You want to put people here, he said, not as a question. I want to put safety here, Adrian said, and power, and chairs that don't pinch, and coffee that doesn't taste like punishment. Power is not kind, Gus said. It does what you tell it until it doesn't, and then it bites. We'll need conduit. We'll need permits to pull from the emergency panel. We'll need a backup for the backup. If you bring me a loud generator, I will set it on fire. No generators, Adrian said. If we can't tie into the hospital's emergency system, we'll build a battery bank. I have a guy. Everyone has a guy, Gus said. Half of them are irresponsible geniuses, and the rest are expensive liars. Find one who is boring, and we can talk. Adrian squinted at the lot and saw, for a second, a ghost of what it could be painted lightly over what it was. He saw walls that were actually screens to keep wind out. He saw rows of outlets mounted at heights both standing and seated people could reach. He saw a small counter that could be a nurse's station if it had to be, and a neighborhood bar if it didn't. He saw a box of toys clustered like a small sun. He saw a sign that said, "Stay," as if the word were a promise and not a threat. He saw that he could pay for this, and that paying would be the easiest part. "Do you have kids?" Gus asked, not unkindly. "I did," Adrian said. "I do in my head." Gus nodded and spat a small syllable toward the fence, not to be rude, but because spitting is sometimes punctuation when grief is mentioned. "We'll need drainage," he said, and just like that, they were partners. The next days were a thrum. Adrian's company had teams for nearly everything, and he grabbed parts of them like you grab the beat of a song and put it to use. He called product for the kiosks because he wanted interfaces that didn't ask anyone to prove they belonged. He called facilities because one of their directors had once built a pop-up store in a week on a roof with no elevator, and he had solved a problem that involved wind, glass, and a disgruntled art collective. He called legal, and when they sighed, he told them a story about a child, and their sigh rearranged itself into a kind of industrious hum. He called communications and told them not to make a press release until families had sat in the chairs and plugged in their machines and the coffee had been tasted by a nurse who knew what good coffee could do at 3 a.m. He went in the afternoons to neighborhoods that were not places he went, usually except when he was talking about them on a stage. He went to a community center with a mural of hands painted on its cinder block exterior and sat in a circle with people who lived on the slope of a fragile hill. He said, "We want to put a door by the hospital." And a grandmother with hair like a Christmas tree angel said, "We needed a door 10 years ago." He went to a church basement where the metal chairs were arranged with an optimism that the room would fill and said, "We will have batteries you can sign out, like books." And a pastor said, "Do you know what happens to batteries that go home?" And he said, "Yes, we will lose some. We will not use that as a reason not to lend." He saw what Marla meant by ugly and also by possible. He saw a man who had learned to sleep sitting up because his wife's lungs faltered at night, and he didn't trust himself horizontal when alarms were tender. He saw a girl with a lap full of homework and a boy with a lap full of wires. He saw a whiteboard with a schedule for a single plug shared among 3 machines and the calculations done in the margins like advanced math. If we plug in at 4 and you plug in at 6 and I can run the compressor until 8, we can get to morning. He learned that power is the currency of health and dignity, and that everyone in the room already knew this and had known it longer than he had known how to say it. The tent, when it arrived, looked like a ghost of a wedding party. It was big enough to house the beginnings of a better idea, and small enough to be built by 8 people before the rain. Gus and his crew ran line after line with the tidy severity of men who had been yelled at by electricity, and learned. A young engineer from Adrian's energy subsidiary, a quiet woman named Priya, whose brain seemed to contain brackets into which problems clicked, designed a battery wall that wasn't just safe, but lovely. Powder-coated cabinets with rounded edges that made them look less like industrial equipment and more like furniture a generous aunt might have installed. She insisted on redundant fuses. She insisted on fire blankets. She insisted on training for anyone who would touch them. When legal asked if they could draft a waiver that said, in essence, "If you die, it's not our fault," Priya said. "We are not building skydiving. We are building shelter." And legal, perhaps because of the way she said it, found another path. They painted the temporary plywood walls in a color called warm pebble because nobody wanted hospital white. They brought in chairs with soft arms and seats wide enough for a body that had not been made by furniture catalogs. They set a narrow table against the back wall for coffee and tea and a basket of granola bars and a sign that said, "Take 2," because people will always limit themselves when you tell them a number, and the number should be generous. They installed a cabinet with a sign-out ledger and several portable power packs in bright blue, each labeled with a number and a phone number to text when you were done. They printed a card with instructions that were mostly pictures and a line at the bottom in English, Tagalog, and Spanish. You do not need to ask permission to sit. You do not need to buy anything to plug in. This is a place for breath. The day they opened, Adrian waited until evening to go. He wanted to arrive when the light shifted and people needed to decide where to go. He walked, not wanting the black car to make a parade out of something that should be a footstep. He turned into the side lot and saw the string of small lights they had looped under the tent's edge. Not festive exactly, but yes, a kind of soft celebration. Gus stood at the entrance like a bouncer at the world's gentlest club. Marla poured coffee with the efficiency of a person who had dealt out medicine at 2 a.m. and learned speed was part of kindness. A volunteer with a knit hat kept the basket of snacks replenished as if it were a strange altar. There were already people in the chairs, a woman asleep with a baby pressed to her chest, the baby's small hand lying like a seashell on her collarbone, a teenager with a portable dialysis unit clicking gently while he scrolled on his phone, a man with a CPAP machine trying it on in daylight so the night would be less scary, a couple murmuring over a battery and reading the card together, their heads bent like a book club. In the corner, like a small returning comet, Mina sat on a low stool with a coloring book open on her lap, the pages made glossy by use. She looked up when she felt the air change and saw him, and smiled in a way that made his ribs loosen. Ramon was talking to Priya, nodding as she demonstrated how a particular cable fit in a particular port. Leo was on a blanket on the floor, supervised by a nurse whose badge said Mel in cheerful letters. He was rolling a toy car across the blanket in a line as straight as a runway and making the sound children make when they're trying not to be too loud, the hum stripped down to its polite components. "You built it," Mina said, simple as that, not surprised, only satisfied that a thing announced had taken shape. "We started it," he said. "It will be better in a month, and better after that, if we listen." She reached into her hoodie pocket and brought out the card he had given them, its edges softened by many fingers. "We still have this," she said, a little sheepish, like someone admitting they kept a band's ticket stub in their wallet. "We didn't lose it." "It was for you to use," he said, "not to return." But he understood what a thing can become in a pocket, a promise you can hold on to. "How is school?" "It's school," she said. "Miss Timmons says I'm aerosaurus, because I made a list for the nurse of kids in my class with inhalers and where they keep them, so if a sub is there, they don't have to guess." She shrugged like she'd just refilled the stapler. "You're a systems designer," he said. "What's that?" "Someone who makes people safer by thinking farther ahead," he said. "It is a job, a good one." She wrinkled her nose. "I thought maybe I would be the person who gets cats out of trees," she said. "But that's the fire department, and cats don't actually do that so much." "You could do both," he said gravely, "design systems and rescue cats." She giggled, quiet so as not to wake the baby in the chair. "I like this place," she said, running her finger along the edge of a battery cabinet. "It smells like coffee and new stuff. It doesn't smell like scared." Her voice dropped, and the next words were a slip to the side. "Sophie would like it, I think." He had told Ramon her name in the parking lot. Of course it had gone home with them. He swallowed and found his voice again where he had left it, near the coffee station. "I hope so," he said, and put a hand for a second on the cabinet, like he could feel a pulse through the metal. The first week was a stream that didn't break. People came in the rain and in the sharp sunlight of late afternoon. They came alone, and in 3 generations, and in pairs that were not exactly friends, but were made of the kind of reliance neighbors knit when time goes wrong. They came to plug in oxygen concentrators, CPAPs, nebulizers, battery packs for power chairs, breast pumps, phones, and a surprising number of electric kettles, because sometimes the thing that keeps the panic from rising is the knowledge that you can boil water and make tea. They came to be seen. Some did not need power. They needed the permission to sit that the sign announced like a flag. There were moments when it creaked. A man angry with the world took a nap in the wrong place and woke loud. A woman with eyes like bruises tried to take 3 battery packs at once, because hoarding can be a form of prayer. A teenager mocked an old man's hiccup of breath because fear makes cruel jokes. Each time the thing did not break. Marla stood up straighter. Gus appeared in the doorway like a storm cloud and then turned into shade. Priya adjusted a cable and explained again that the red light meant wait and the green light meant go, and people accepted this as if she were a traffic cop sent for them alone. Each time, Adrian stood at the edge and felt that he had built a bridge over a ditch, a modest bridge, the kind you make from planks, but a bridge all the same. The media came eventually because work that looks like goodness is honey, and cameras are bees. Communications tried to put their bodies between the cameras and the people who didn't want to be stories. Adrian agreed to one interview and spoke only in sentences that began with "we." He insisted the shot be framed in a way that cut him off at the chest, so that the background was chairs, not his face. He began to learn again the old lesson that the most useful thing a rich man can do is not make himself the point. Then came the storm. It was not a spectacular storm. It was not the kind where news vans park on the edge of a cliff to film the obvious. It began as an ordinary tangle of weather on a Thursday afternoon when the air felt like a damp towel and the sky had the pallor of a headache. Adrian was in his office, the windows muttering with rain, when the lights flickered and his entire staff made the noise people make when they are reminded they depend on things they cannot see. The building's backup system clicked in, and the hum in the walls hummed a decibel lower and then steadied. His phone buzzed with the hospital's alert. Power outage across the district, rolling blackouts expected, non-essential services to be triaged. He did not ask if the door was essential. He grabbed his jacket and took the stairs because waiting for an elevator in a storm is a lesson we all learn and then forget. The streets were a wet braid of red brake lights. He cut through 2 alleys he did not usually cut through and arrived breathless, older than he liked to feel, at the side lot. The tent was lit like a lighthouse. The battery wall sang its steady song. The chairs were filled, and people had that look of a party you didn't plan for, but are making the best of. Shoulders closer together, voices pitched like music shared between strangers. Gus had an extension ladder propped against the side in case the gutters did something dramatic. Marla was on the phone with someone at the city, yelling in the tone polite people use when the thing they are interrogating is not a person, but a policy. Priya had her hand on the battery bank, her cheek pressed to the metal, as if she could tell the future by listening. "We're good," she said without opening her eyes. "We're drawing from the hospital's backup and topping up the cabinets. We can run for 36 hours on the cabinets alone if I'm careful, and no one plugs in something insane like a space heater." "No space heaters!" Gus bellowed toward the tent as if anyone had even thought it. People laughed, and the laugh bounced off the tent's ribs and made the place feel stronger.